body. What is it?
Dr. Fleming of St Mary's Hospital, London, who discovered that it produces the drug known as penicillin.
The question was, which drug would go with which cell?
It's a collaboration that's unexpected because it's between humans and the tiniest organisms.
The howl of a dire wolf.
Dorset lamb may represent a major landmark.
I did not start off planning to design proteins.
Scientific breakthrough will probably be something that we hard to imagine.
Test at birth could map out an individual's entire future risk of disease.
And just tell me a bit more about the MedTech device, because I don't think there was much online about it.
There's not. It's a device I thought of, one of those things that wakes you up at 2 a.m. when, you know, you've been practicing clinical medicine for all these years and you've experienced situations where you're frustrated by the status quo and you've realized, wait a minute, why don't we have a better way to do this? Like, why am I dealing with this problem? And for me, something that is just a critical part of neurosurgery and a lot of the surgery I do is our ability to measure the pupil and the pupillary reflex. And, you know, when you see a TV show, and they have a neurologist on the television show or a neurosurgeon, they're always shining a flashlight in the patient's eyes, right? Like it's a classic thing that you see. And the reason they show it so often is that you get an incredible amount of information about the functioning of the brain and the nervous system and other things that's going on just by looking at how quickly your pupils respond to light. And you can almost think of it like a vital sign. You know, we measure blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate, and, you know, we have these O2 monitors that give us continuous information about the health of the respiratory system or the cardiac system. And the pupil is a similar type of vital sign that gives you information about the health of the nervous system and the visual system. And it also tells you about how much, you know, narcotics you have on board or how much pain you're in. If you're in pain, your pupil dilates. So there's all this information. And right now, the way we do it is the nurse will go to the patient's bedside. Usually it's an unconscious patient or anesthetized or someone who it can't respond and just say, hey, I'm doing fine. Like we want to get information from someone who's you're not able to talk to them. So they have to forcibly open the patient's eye and shine a light in there and then estimate the size of the pupil. It makes no sense. And they only do it once every hour or so. And every other vital sign that we measure in the ICU or the operating room, we measure continuously. We don't measure it intermittently. And so the idea was to create a way to measure the pupillary reflex continuously and through a closed eyelid, which we have no way of doing right now. And then once you start thinking about that, which initially I thought of for one particular use case that we could go into if you're interested, but you know, then you start to think, well, what else could we learn? When else can we use this? What else? What other use case can we think of? And then you start thinking of more and more ways to use it because there's so much information in the pupil that we're just ignoring. So that was the foundation of the idea, and it kind of woke me up in the middle of the night. And then the more I thought about it, and then you do the patent searches, and you start to figure out what the market is, and you start to talk to people about how do you start a MedTech company, and what do VCs look for, you know, when they invest in it. Does it make any sense to do this? And that kind of led down many, many rabbit holes, as you can imagine.
Interesting. I think that the whole concept of there's a lot of data in the pupil has been floating around the public consciousness in the last few years. I think there was I forget exactly what endpoint they measured, but there was a trial a few years ago where I think they estimated your likelihood of death and metabolic disease just from a picture of your retina through a machine learning model, for example.
Yeah.
And then I've never thought about being able to detect this data when the patient's eyes are closed, right? So what's the technology that allows you to do that, and what can it be used for?
You know, the simple way to think about it is just infrared light, right? We know, and that's how we monitor the pupil now. There are quantitative pupilometers that use infrared light because, you know, if you can take a picture of the pupil, see the size with an open eye, but if you shine light in the eye, you're going to change the size of the pupil. So if you look at it with infrared light, what's nice is it doesn't change the size of the pupil. But infrared light also passes through the eyelid better than visible light because all of the melanin and things in the eyelid will absorb visible light, but infrared light will pass through it much more effectively. And so we can use infrared light to measure the pupil through a closed eyelid. And there have been a couple papers written on this. So the proof of principle and the concept are already out there, you know, in the ether. But how do you exactly design it and the specifics of that and make it something that fits into a hospital environment as opposed to a laboratory is also something unique about the device we developed.
Interesting. Let's take a step back. Obviously, you're a best-selling author. You have a new book, but previously, you and you still are one of the world's best neurosurgeons. Tell us about that journey of sort of going through medical school, deciding that you wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and what kind of went to that decision? Yeah,
I did not go into med school thinking I was going to become a brain surgeon. You know, there's some kids who grow up that way. They're sort of fascinated by that idea and the sort of the myth of the brain surgeon that I explore in the book. But that was not me. My father was a Freudian psychoanalyst, so I was kind of interested in the brain and the mind. And during med school, I majored in philosophy and English, and I was interested in how language gets processed in the brain, and maybe thought about neurology, but not surgery. You know, I grew up thinking, because my father was a psychoanalyst, that doctors sort of sit in a room and talk to someone else and, you know, create this relationship with someone. And surgery is just this aggressive, invasive relationship between two people where you're literally violating their body in a way that is completely unnatural. And it was foreign to me. And then as I went through my med school rotations, you start to encounter surgeons. And I knew nothing about who surgeons were and what they did and how they practiced. And when you rotate through the different specialties in medicine, you meet the different personalities of the people that practice different types of medicine, and you see who you get along with. And maybe it was because I grew up, you know, somewhat of an athlete. Like, I was not a great athlete, but I played football and I played basketball. And the surgeons just had this attitude of like, there's a problem and we're going to fix it. You know, we're not going to talk about it for 5 hours. And we have to make a decision quickly. We have to make it with inadequate information, and we're going to do the best we can. And we're going to focus on this problem with 110% of our attention for the next couple hours, and then we're going to move on. And that appealed to my personality, because medical doctors, when you're on rounds with them, they talk about, you know, all the different medical problems, and most people have like 6 or 7 or 8 medical problems if they're sick. They have high blood pressure, they have obesity, you know, they have diabetes. And you're so, well, let's raise the dose of this drug, and we'll lower the dose of this drug, and this one is going to interact with this, and let's come back. We'll see him again in 6 weeks and see if he's any better or she's any better. And it's a very slow pace, right? I mean, it's intellectual and it's fascinating, but it's a slow pace. And surgeons are like sort of the Navy SEALs of, you know, see a problem, fix a problem, work the problem, get it done. You know, don't hem and haw forever, because you do not have time. You need to make a decision. Go in there, and then move on. And so I loved that. And the first time I walked into an operating room and saw brain surgery, it was this moment of awe to me. And that's one of the things I tried to capture in the book, of that awe when you see someone literally open up a human skull and expose the human brain and sit there for hours meticulously dissecting and working on the brain through a microscope. It's an incredible thing to watch. And once I saw it, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. I just thought, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen a human being do, you know, to another human being. And if I have a chance to do it, what an incredible opportunity. And I'm going to pursue that as much as I can. And it's a terrifying prospect, because what you hear about neurosurgery is the commitment, the sacrifice. Like, they all get divorced, you know, you're not going to have a life again. And I had a million other interests. I was a musician, sports, whatever. All the things that you do when you're in college. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to give up everything that's important to me just to pursue this one idea. So it's terrifying to make that decision. But I also had an epiphany. There was one night when I was leaving the hospital. It was like 9 o'clock at night, and I was a medical student. And I saw the gastroenterologists walking out at 9 p.m. And I saw the internists walking out at 9 p.m. because they were passionate about what they did also. And I realized, like, these guys are working, or women, men and women are both working incredibly hard also. And if I want to be great at whatever I do, I'm going to be working really hard at it, was the bottom line. And I'm going to have to give up other things to be great at whatever I do. And I might as well do the thing that I really want to do, as opposed to say, oh, it's going to be too hard. Maybe, pediatrician will be easier. Because if you want to be great at anything, it's a lot of work. And if you're dedicated to it, you're going to have to give up and sacrifice other things. So that helped me make the decision to just do neurosurgery and to do something I thought would sustain me for the rest of my life as a career.
Fascinating. I think it takes a very unique psychological profile to commit to the amount of strenuous labor, physical labor, and the sort of physical toll that it takes on your body. I imagine that in the sort of early days of being on a rotation, you would have gotten a sense for how demanding it was going to be. And like, despite this, you sort of persisted, right?
Yeah, I was very resentful of that early on because I actually had excruciating back pain when I would stand in the operating room. After 20 minutes, my back would start to hurt. And I thought, oh, how am I going to do this job? Like, why does it demand so much of me? The other thing was I hated waking up early in the morning. Like, I was someone who preferred to sleep late. And I remember on my general surgery rotation at Mass General, we're here in Boston. This is where I did my medical school. I remember waking up at like 3:30 or 4 in the morning to get on the orange line, and in the middle of winter. So it was pitch black, and it was like 10 below, and it was snowing, and I was standing there outside, in Jamaica Plain, whatever, and was just freezing. And I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, why are they making me do this just because I want to be a surgeon? Why do I have to go through this abusive lifestyle? But you just put your head down and you do the work. I remember I cut out a little saying from Thomas Paine that I would put on my mirror. You have these sayings that you put up that try to inspire you. And it was the saying that motivated me was, these are the times that try men's souls. It could be women's souls, people's souls, make it gender neutral. But it was this sense of like, historically, everybody has to go through difficult times to achieve anything that you want to do if you want to be good at it. So like, this is no different. You're not suffering any more than anyone else. Like, don't whine and complain about it. I had another great experience, another quick story. I remember when I was doing my residency, and I trained at Columbia in New York City. My parents lived in Manhattan, so I grew up in Manhattan. And I was staying over at their house, at my apartment where I grew up one night. And I woke up in the morning at whatever it was, 5 in the morning to go to work. And there was a doorman there, really nice guy who I knew, who took me in the elevator. I lived on the second floor. He took me down in the elevator, and I went to work. And I came back at like midnight that night, right? So I'd been working, however many hours it was, 15, 17, 18 hours. I was exhausted. And I came back, and the same doorman was there letting me in, who had worked just as long as I had. And he had a smile on his face, and he's like, hey, welcome back, nice to see you again. We chatted. And that was also this awakening. It's like, don't feel sorry for yourself because you're working hard, because there's a lot of people out there working hard. And not only that, you're a resident now and you're working that hard, but you're going to be a neurosurgeon. Like, you're not going to be a doorman for the rest of your life, potentially. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that wasn't my aspiration. So that was another moment of sort of epiphany where you say like, hey, just put your head down, get the work done. Things are going to be good.
Yeah, my impression is that you listen to a lot of motivational music because these concepts are very much conveyed in the sort of songs that I listen to when I'm like in the gym, for example. But yeah, I think the important point there is that everyone kind of works equally hard. And that regardless of the difficulty of the problem that you're trying to solve or the career that you're trying to master or the skill set that you're trying to develop, it's just equally hard, right? Like, this goes for starting companies as well. They always say at YC, it's sort of equally challenging to start a sort of low-hanging fruit company than it is to start a very massively ambitious company, because a massively ambitious company also draws the world's best talent. It makes it easier to get funding. And I think this kind of goes for careers as well. Like, if you're an ambitious person, it makes sense to go after the most challenging burden that you could possibly bear and to take pleasure in the pain of your attempt at getting at mastery, right? But it isn't for everyone still, right? There's a level of demanding physical toll that it takes. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon when I was in medical school. I went to visit the head of neurosurgery at the hospital that I was going to be at, and I asked her, well, I just tried to talk to her, and I went to her office. And in that meeting, it actually was the moment that changed my mind. I mean, it was like a dingy little office. She was like at the very top of the hospital, but it didn't, like, it felt like a miserable experience day to day. And she told me that she had just paralyzed a patient that week, and she was feeling depressed, and just like the magnitude of the responsibility that you're undertaking when you are being bestowed with the privilege of interacting with as you say, that the patient's most prized possession. But there is awe in it as well, and I want to touch on that. Like, what are the moments that you look back on and you're like, wow, this was the right career for me. This is something that I am experiencing true joy and mastery at when I'm in the zone.
One of the things that has been the most meaningful to me in my career has been the work that I did in what we call in neurosurgery minimally invasive neurosurgery or endoscopic skull-based surgery. We have all these terms that we use. But when I started training in neurosurgery, if you wanted to remove a tumor that sat underneath the brain, right? You can imagine if you have a tumor sitting at the top of the brain, sure, I can imagine open up the skin, take off the bone, there's the tumor, take it out. Great. But what if the tumor is underneath the brain? How are you going to get there? So traditionally, and the way I learned to do it, you'd make a very big incision in the skin. You'd remove a very big piece of skull, and then you would have to lift up the brain to go around it to get underneath to the bottom of the brain. And you use a microscope to do it. You do it very delicately, but it's still, you're moving a lot of stuff around. You're taking down all the muscles of chewing. And right when I came out of my training, there was a very small group of neurosurgeons who were starting to think about, can we take these same tumors out just by going up through the nostrils? We're not going to make any incisions. We're going to use a natural orifice. And we're going to use an endoscope, which is a long, thin telescope. And you know, we do arthroscopic surgery, all different types of surgery in the abdomen with scopes. Can we do that up the nose? And the sinus surgeons, the ENT surgeons were doing it, but they were just doing it to open up the nasal sinuses. They weren't actually going any further than that. So a small group of us started teaming up with ENT surgeons, and I teamed up with a guy named Vijay Anand, who's a brilliant ENT surgeon, a rhinologist, they're called, to basically take these endoscopes, go up through the nose, and then keep going, right? We're going to go deep into the brain and work from the bottom up instead of from the top down. So we kind of turned the whole idea on its head, if you will. And the trick was, how do you do that without causing massive meningitis or an infection? Because the nose is not sterile. There's no way to sterilize the nose. And when you think about doing surgery, it's so critical. You put betadine on everything, you put drapes on everything, everything's sterile. The brain is completely sterile. If you get bacteria in the brain, it's a disaster. So here we are doing surgery on the deepest parts of the brain, and we're going up through a dirty corridor up the nose. And most of the senior neurosurgeons, my teachers, people who've been doing this for so long, said, that's crazy. You're going to kill everybody. You should not be doing that. And so you were meeting resistance, and we're trying to change the way neurosurgery is done to make it easier on the patient. It turns out not only can it be done, but what was so gratifying in my career was 25 years ago when I started doing it, nobody was doing it, and everyone was skeptical of it. And now, fast forward, everybody does it at every hospital in the world, right? And it is now the standard of care to go up through the nose to take out specific tumors in certain locations that we can get at more easily. And if you give them antibiotics and you know how to close the hole after you make it, they don't get infections. So that was really rewarding. And then about 10 years ago, I was invited to South Korea. And just to state something about going through the nose, the group of neurosurgeons who were doing it first were actually this small group of neurosurgeons in Italy. And I went to Italy to learn how to do it from them. So I had this sense of like, you know, America's not doing everything perfectly, and maybe we can learn from people elsewhere in the world. So I was invited to South Korea and to talk about the surgery up the nose. And I went to their meeting, and there was a small group of neurosurgeons there who were starting to take out tumors through the eyelid, making a little incision in the eyelid and actually working around the eye. Now, you don't imagine that there's room between the bone of the orbit and the eye itself. Like, how can you work in there? Like, if you put your finger there, it feels like the sphere of your eye is right up against the bone. But it turns out that the eye takes up about 50% of the space of the eye socket. And you can gently move the eye over and work around the eye to take out tumors that otherwise you'd have to open up the side of the head to get there. And so I started doing that very early and was one of the first neurosurgeons in the United States to start doing what we call transorbital surgery, endoscopic transorbital surgery. So the thing that I'm most proud of is that I was a part of And I wasn't like the first, and I wasn't the only one. It's always a group of us who are sort of doing it together and learning from each other. But I was a part of one of the early pioneers who basically said, this is a better way to do it. Let's figure this out. And let's move the needle forward, and let's move neurosurgery forward. Now, what's terrifying about that, and it speaks to what you were saying about when you walked into that neurosurgeon's office in Australia, and she had just paralyzed someone that week. That is one of the burdens of what we do that is so difficult for us to deal with, because we go into medicine trying to help people, right? That's why you go into medicine. You don't want to hurt anybody. God forbid. Like, the only reason you chose to go into medicine is because you desperately want to help people and make the world a better place. But no one really tells you that, hey, if you choose neurosurgery and you choose high-risk neurosurgery, you're going to hurt 3%, 4%. Those are just the risks in anybody's hands. You can be the best neurosurgeon in the world. You're never going to have a 100% success rate. You're not. And in fact, the way to become a good neurosurgeon is by making mistakes, because as you know, we all learn from mistakes. How does a founder learn about a company? They make mistakes, and their first 3 companies fail, and the 4th company, they make $1 billion. So the only way to become great at neurosurgery is to make mistakes, and those mistakes hurt people, even though you're doing your best. It doesn't mean you're a bad surgeon, but then you have to live with those mistakes. You have to wake up and know that you hurt someone else, and that person is incredibly disappointed in you, and you're disappointed in yourself. But the other thing is, you got to wake up tomorrow morning and do it again, maybe twice. And the next day, do it again, and do it again, and do it again. And how do you get back on? How do you build your confidence back up after a crushing defeat like that? That is one of the challenges of what we do. That's the most difficult thing that they don't really talk about. It's not just technically that hard. The myth of the brain surgeon is it's so hard. It's not brain surgery. It's not brain surgery. But what makes brain surgery so hard is not that it's like rocket science. We're not solving quadratic equations. It's that we're bearing the responsibility of potentially hurting other people. Now, most of the time it goes great, right? And most of the time you're helping someone. And that's the most incredible thing, particularly if you're doing a surgery, as we were talking about, that very few people in the world can do. So there was a period in my career where I was one of a handful of people in the world who were doing this. And I'd have patients flying in from around the world saying, hey, we hear you can take this tumor out through an eyebrow incision or an eyelid incision or my nose. Where we're from, they're all telling me they have to open up our head. And I'm like, yeah, I can do it. And that was really fun and exciting. Then you write papers about it, and you write books on it, you teach other people how to do it. It becomes your career, which is super rewarding and super exciting. But no matter how good you are at it, you're not perfect. And there are always going to be complications, and there are always going to be mistakes that you make that are always going to happen, and you have to live with those. And that's the burden of neurosurgery.
Fascinating. I think it must be super empowering and just, it would be very gratifying to be looking back on your career at the stage that you're at, having basically been involved in pioneering a whole new field of minimally invasive neurosurgery, just having this plentiful experience and being at the top of your field, right? So you're kind of all the way on the other side. And there's another batch of students, these medical students that are kind of vying for this job that you have maybe in a few decades. And I'm curious what your advice would be for them. Like, what's the makeup of a good neurosurgeon? Is it intelligence? Is it the amount of time that they invest in doing that particular rotation, research experience? What's the advice on that front?
So grit is a big part of it. You have to have thick skin. You have to be willing to work hard. You can't, be upset that you had plans and your plans were canceled. You have to put in the time and the effort to learn the skill set to do what you need to do. And it has to become, to some extent, while you're doing it, it is your number one priority. Your family is great. And, my family is incredibly important to me. But if I'm in the operating room, I can't be thinking about my family, and I'm not thinking about them. I mean, there have been moments with I can tell you stories about phone calls where my son was choking, whatever, and I was in the operating room. Luckily, my wife managed to dislodge the thing from his throat so he could breathe again. But,
wow.
you can't be interrupted by the outside world. You don't want to be. I mean, often we are, because we're also managing patients on the floor who can be having problems, or there's patients in the ER who you're dealing with while you're in the operating room, and it's very hard to completely isolate yourself. But what makes a great neurosurgeon is not just raw intelligence, and it's technically, you have to be, reasonably coordinated. And you can't be uncoordinated. And occasionally you do see residents coming through who you realize just technically are not going to be great neurosurgeons. But you don't have to be, and there are some who are technically incredible, right? As you can imagine, it's just we know that there's a human range, and there's no test beforehand to let you know whether you're going to be good or bad. And that's another thing that I remember being anxious about, because it's a 7-year training program, right? So I was thinking, what if I sign up to do this 7-year training, and at age 33, when I finally get to do the most technically difficult neurosurgery, I realize I suck at it. Like that's gonna be awful to know that. Luckily, most people, if you're reasonably coordinated, will get the coordination, and are smart enough. But you have to be compassionate. You have to put other people's interests before your own, and you have to have a lot of grit and determination in order to make the sacrifices to get through the training and be good at it, and then consistently put your patients first.
Understood. Yeah, this is great advice. I think the other thing that I wanted to chat to you about is the fact that a lot of our audience, despite being medical students or sort of medical trainees, are interested in entrepreneurship. And it seems that I think like most people, when they think about entrepreneurship, they think you have to have a PhD. Obviously, there are founders that have medical degrees instead. You have a medical degree. I don't think you did a PhD. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what does a transition look like between being a practicing doctor, being able to found your own company? How flexible is the career? And what's just been your experience of that?
Well, in terms of the medicine and entrepreneurship, I was thinking a lot of the book I write about the history of neurosurgery. I sprinkle it throughout because it's a really fascinating history. And I started to think that like Harvey Cushing was the quintessential founder in a way, because he came upon a field that didn't exist. Neurosurgery did not exist at the turn of the century. There were no surgeons who dedicated all their time to just doing one thing, which was neurosurgery. Most were general surgeons who dabbled in it. And he decided to devote his career to it. And when he started operating, the mortality rate of neurosurgery, brain surgery, was 50%. Half the patients died. And by the end of his career, it was 8%. So he basically single-handedly devoted his life, sacrificed everything in order to found a new company, which was Neurosurgery Incorporated, right? So that neurosurgery from then on is like a cell phone. Like from then on, like the world changed, and now suddenly neurosurgery became a safe thing to do. And then there were other revolutions, neurosurgeons who brought the microscope in, or who created, stereotaxis, which is how we use computers to navigate around the brain. All of those are essentially the same as founding a new company. They're coming up with a new idea that's changing their world, right? With the world of neurosurgery, nobody's heard of these people or knows what they did. And part of my book was to say, hey, like, you should know the names of like the top 3 or 4 neurosurgeons in the world who literally have changed the world. These are the Steve Jobses and the Bill Gateses and the Elon Musks of brain surgery. Like, let's make those names known to the public, because they are founders who have changed the world as much as anyone else. So to that extent, and all the other thing to mention about my career is I also ran a basic science lab. I was a scientist. And I would write NIH grants and do research on rats mostly to work. Most of my lab work was in epilepsy, even though most of my surgeries were in tumors. So founding a MedTech company is essentially like starting a lab to some degree, because we have to solve a problem. Like there's a physics problem that we have to solve to figure out how to make this device work. So we're doing experiments, and we're using modeling, and we're using statistics and machine learning and AI. All the stuff that we did in my lab to figure out how epilepsy spread through the brain is just another problem that we have to solve. And once you solve the problem, then you have to do clinical trials. You have to try it in humans. And I'm writing an NIH grant, multiple NIH grants and NSF grants and things like that right now, just like I did for my lab. They're the same grants. And the difference, of course, is thinking about the market and pitching to VC and VCs, which we're not at the stage at because we're sort of pre-seed. Then you have to start thinking of like, is this a viable product? Are people going to buy it? Is it going to penetrate? How much are we going to charge for it? That's a whole different skill set. And there are people probably better suited, potentially than I am to do that, although I'd love to learn more about that and do that. But the early stage is very similar to being a doctor or a researcher, because you're basically solving a problem and then designing clinical trials to prove that it works, which is exactly what I've been doing for 30 years.
Understood. I think it's just important to stress for our audience who sort of has not encountered you before, just the sheer number of things that you are balancing, right? I mean, at some point you were balancing, obviously, a clinical career, being a neurosurgeon, which is in itself a full-time career, with a research lab. You're one of the most highly cited clinicians in history. I would put you akin to the Robert Langer of medicine. And then now you're starting a company. So I guess I'm wondering, to what extent is this like sheer ambition and the ability to multitask? Like, what do you credit to your success?
Curiosity. That's all it is. It's not ambition, it's curiosity. It's wanting to know the answer and figure something out. So whether it's figuring out neurosurgery, it takes a lifetime, right? So I could, and I've written papers on this actually. I tried to trace my results over 1,000, doing the same operation 1,000 times, or similar operation, showing that I get better and better. Even the last 100 times I did it. So after 900 operations, the next 100, I did a little better than the prior 900, and I think what motivates me is just curiosity. When I wrote the book, which is another thing that I took on while I was doing neurosurgery and writing a lab, I was like, I'm going to write a book. It was because I was curious about the frontal lobotomy. I wanted to learn more about the frontal lobotomy. I wanted to figure out what the myths were of the neurosurgeon and where those myths came from. And as I started reading about all that stuff, I started writing about it. And with each new chapter, it was more like, wow, I'm going to write about this. I'm so curious who did this first or why this was done. And so I just read a lot of papers, just like I would if I were writing a paper. You have to become an expert in whatever that thing is, learn about it. And then the joy of writing. I also enjoy writing. I enjoy putting my thoughts down on paper and sort of crafting a story or a narrative, whether it's a research paper or it's a grant or it's a book. You're basically telling a story in all of those situations to try to convince someone why this idea is important. And in the writing is when you figure out your ideas, because when you have them in your head, you kind of, they're muddled around. When you have to put them down on paper, then they have to make sense. And to me, writing is another way of thinking. And it allows me to tap into my curiosity and answer those questions that are burning inside of me that need to be answered.
And let's talk about the book. So this is in 2024, you published Gray Matters, a biography of brain surgery. You mentioned your motivations for this a little bit earlier on, you wanted to showcase the true founders of neurosurgery, the Steve Jobses and the Elon Musks. But what did you want your readers to walk away from this book learning and being inspired?
I wanted people to understand what it is that neurosurgeons really do, because I thought that, and I would have conversations with friends of mine, at cocktail parties. They're like, oh, you're a brain surgeon, what's that's like? And they don't really understand it, and you can't really convey it in 15 minutes. The weight of the responsibility that you have, and also the breadth of the types of things that we do, whether it's concussion, and the whole concussion story, or it's clipping an aneurysm, or it's taking out a brain tumor, or it's designing helmets so that motorcycles can be safer. There's just a broad range of things that we tackle as neurosurgeons that people don't have a good concept of. So I also wanted to get through that whole gamut of experience, and also then say, think about all the celebrities and politicians and people who've been touched by neurosurgery. How have we changed the world? How have neurosurgeons changed the world? And I also thought it would be interesting for a reader to hear the stories of people that they know. So whether you're talking about JFK's assassination or Natasha Richardson falling down and hitting her head, all these things that are sort of in the zeitgeist of our culture that we kind of know about, but we don't really understand why they're important or how would a neurosurgeon view these events. When Bob Saget falls down in his hotel room and dies, like everyone, there's a million articles in People magazine about it. So I sort of said, all right, I'm going to dissect that and tell you why this is interesting. Or Michael J. Fox, his Parkinson's surgery and talk about Parkinson's disease and who did the first surgery for Parkinson's disease. Again, it's curiosity, and being able to tell that story from beginning to end and make it interesting to a lay reader who's curious about where that came from.
Interesting. Well, I haven't read the book yet, but I definitely will now. Maybe you can convince me through it that I should go back into.
Yeah, it's not a technical book. Like, it's for a lay reader. It's for anybody to read. And I specifically wrote it that way, but who's curious about what neurosurgery is, what neurosurgeons do. But it's not a textbook in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. Let's touch on image-guided techniques. So obviously you've had a relatively long career now, probably seen the evolution of CT and MRI and fluorescence-based approaches to sort of guiding in surgery. Tell us about that. What sort of changed? What's still left?
Well, imaging is critical to surgery. It's really, there's two aspects to surgery. It's seeing it and then touching it in some way. Like, you have to see what you're going to do, and then you have to physically affect whatever that thing is. So obviously, originally, we're seeing with our eyes, but we can now supplement that vision so we can see things that our eyes can't see, whether it's seeing through objects, with MRI or CAT scan, making certain things fluoresce that normally we couldn't see. So I talk about, glioblastoma surgery and how the patient can drink something, it goes into the tumor, and you put blue light on, and suddenly that tumor fluoresces pink, and you can see the tumor where you couldn't see it beforehand. But there's also the touching, how do we affect change? The obvious thing is manually with your hands, right? We can do it that way. We can put radiation into the brain and focus radiation at a small point. So that's changing things with, through the electromagnetic spectrum. And then the new way that we're doing it now is with sound. So there's a new device called a focused ultrasound. And what focused ultrasound does is it takes sound waves, very, very high frequency sound waves that can pass through the skull. And by having 1,000 emitters around the outside of the skull that all meet at a point, each one of those sound waves passes through the skull harmlessly, but where they all meet together, they affect some sort of change because they put energy in the brain. And so now we can change the brain without even opening the skull. So it's essentially surgery without opening the skull, just like radiosurgery is that as well. But not only can we make little lesions in the brain, so you can have someone who has a tremor who comes in and we use this ultrasound machine and their tremor goes away. It's almost miraculous. But we can open up what's called the blood-brain barrier, which is this natural barrier that separates any drug in your bloodstream. Not everything gets into the brain. The brain protects itself because when you drink things, when we evolved on this planet, we didn't want toxins in our bloodstream to go to our brain. They wanted to protect the brain. So there's a barrier that prevents stuff from going in. And we can use ultrasound to basically open that up, which means that now we can give drugs that someone can take through drinking it or an IV, and it can pass into the brain in very specific areas. We can direct where that's going to go by opening up the barrier between the brain and the blood using ultrasound waves, which pass through the skull without cutting into it. So the idea, of course, for neurosurgery, the ultimate goal is to put us all out of business so that we don't have to open up the head anymore to do what we want to do. We can just use like a Star Trek tricorder, and do neurosurgery that way. That's the goal.
Fascinating. And I presume also for sort of neuropsychiatric disorders, I've heard of this sort of focused ultrasound being used. Is that also true?
It has a potential use it depends which ones you're talking about, but for Alzheimer's disease, for example, the thought is that maybe if they open up the blood-brain barrier, that we can wash some of the plaques out of the brain that cause Alzheimer's disease. For Parkinson's disease, it's mostly the tremor that you're trying to stop. And for any disease where you want to get a drug into a particular part of the brain, using focused ultrasound, again, to open the blood-brain barrier would be very useful to treat diseases that way. The other way to do it is with what's called deep brain stimulation, which is to put electrodes in the brain. And we now originally would put one electrode in, and we would turn that electrode on, and it would either stimulate the brain and excite neurons, or it would block the neurons from firing. And that was used very often to treat tremors, again, but also depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, And we realized you can sort of change people's personalities by stimulating parts of the brain or quieting parts of the brain. Because, and I get to this in the book a bit, the brain is what makes ourselves, who we are, our personalities and our behavior. And by manipulating the brain, we can actually change someone's personality and change their behavior and essentially override their own free will and sense of self and alter that. And that also is the future of neurosurgery, which is, the power to change another human being, but also the power to give another human being abilities that they didn't have. And that's where we get into things like brain-computer interfaces, which plays into VC and new businesses. And there's 5 or 6 new brain-computer interface companies that are making devices that are implanted somewhere in the brain to take people's thoughts and allow one to control a computer or a robotic arm just by thinking. Driving a car, flying a plane, all of those things that were science fiction in the past, we have the ability to do now.
It is truly amazing to see the progress that BCIs have made, and kind of especially recently, not attracting a lot of attention from the general public. There was a time when Neuralink was doing these press releases, and it was getting a lot of attention. I think now that's like somewhat quieted down. But you're on the scientific advisory board of a BCI company called Precision Neuroscience. And they have a very unique approach to this that's kind of different from the Tom Moxley approach and Elon Musk's approach at Neuralink. Talk a bit about that and what's different about it. What's unique about it?
Yeah, so their founder is a guy named Ben Rappaport, who is a super smart and incredibly nice and a great friend of mine. He trained under me at one point at Cornell, was my fellow. And he also inspired, now I train with him because watching what he did with Precision Neuroscience honestly inspired me to try to start a company of my own because I was so impressed by what he was trying to do and able to do. But the basic difference between Synchron, Neuralink, and Precision. Synchron is Oxley's company that puts an electrode in a blood vessel. And right now it's the main blood vessel that runs in the middle of the brain. And that, it's basically a stent that goes in the blood vessel, and it records from the nearby neurons. The advantage of that type of technique is that it is truly minimally invasive and that it can be implanted with essentially a needle stick in the groin or in the wrist, and you could advance it up and place it. The downside is because it's so small and it's only accessing a very specific part of the brain, the amount of information you can get out is limited. So right now, based on the papers I've read, they have to combine it with eye tracking. So if a patient is paralyzed and trying to control a cursor on a screen to type something out, it uses eye tracking to move the cursor around, and then they can click just by thinking yes or no where they want to, what they want to do. The Neuralink device, which is Elon's device, is basically a new iteration of an old device, which is called the Utah array. And the Utah array has been around since maybe the 1980s or so. And it was an array of 100 electrodes, basically the size of a pea, that you could tap into the brain. And each of those electrodes would record from small groups of neurons. And so you're getting very, very high resolution information from individual neurons firing in the brain so that someone can think and effectuate a change on a computer. And that allows information to come out at a very high rate, very detailed information, very high bit rate, if you will. But it's invasive, right? The electrodes are going into the brain. And so it's relatively easy to access the surface of the brain, but things that are between the hemispheres of the brain, it's not clear how you're going to get there. And what Elon did, or his group did, I would say, that really was fascinating and a terrific new idea, was to make these electrodes not rigid but flexible. Because the brain, if you're a neurosurgeon, you know this, the brain pulsates. Every time you breathe and every time your heart beats, the brain is pulsating. So it's pulsating, 60 times per second, and then it's also slowly pulsating with every respiratory rate. And so by having these electrodes be soft and flexible, they kind of move with the brain. The Utah array electrodes didn't last that long because the brain does not like having a foreign object in it, and it would create a scar around those electrodes. Neuralink claims that their electrodes are so small, and they're so small that they need a robot to actually place those electrodes. They're so small, they claim that there's not a scar around them and that they'll last for a long period of time. It's not, I'm not sure that's true, but they've said that their data supports that. What precision neuroscience does that's different, instead of putting the electrodes in the brain, it puts the electrodes on the surface of the brain. It just lays them right on top. So there's no penetration of the brain. And we know those electrodes can last for decades because we've put electrodes on the surface of the brain already for decades for epilepsy and things like that. So there'll be no rejection of it. It also allows you to slip those electrodes between the hemispheres of the brain to reach other places. And the first device that Precision is making also has about 1,000 electrodes in something the size of a postage stamp. So it's very, very small. So it's high resolution, it's flexible, and it can tunnel out through the skin, or ideally you want it implanted permanently in a subcutaneous device. You don't want anything, wires coming out of the head. You want it all self-contained, so no one even knows that it's in there. So just to summarize, the main difference is Synchron, the electrodes are in a blood vessel. They don't get a lot of data out. Neuralink, the electrodes are in the brain, so they're getting single neuron recordings, but it's invasive into the brain. Precision, they lie on the surface of the brain, so you're sort of getting the summed activity. You're not getting individual neurons firing, but you're getting populations of neurons. And it may be, and we know that is sufficient to get an enormous amount of data out of the brain in terms of quantity of data and speed at which you can remove that information. But what's really interesting is there are these different devices, and each one is going to get better and better over time. And we don't know which is going to be the best device. So like, the VCs are betting on, it's like a horse race. You're betting on the different horses. You're not sure which is going to win. It may be that one is better for one type of activity, another is better for another type of activity. And it's also, which is the team that's going to be able to bring this to the finish line. But it's sort of a fun moment in history where we have these different groups. There's another one called, I think, Palantir, that is another company that makes also a really interesting device that's similar to the Utah Ray. Which of these is going to win the race, or whether there'll be multiple winners of the race, like the different Android phone versus iPhone, things like that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely a wondrous time of history that we're in. And I think that they'll all have their own heydays, right? Like it seems that we're experiencing the full spectrum of highly invasive but extremely high bandwidth to minimally invasive and very little bandwidth. And that, especially if you want to sort of merge with AI, as Elon says, you probably want to put an electrode next to every single neuron, or as many neurons as you possibly can.
Well, it's not clear that you need to do that to get the information out. It's not clear. It may be enough. In fact, you may be losing the forest for the trees by doing that, putting all those in there. And it may not technically be feasible to put in that many. Also, remember, the brain is covered with blood vessels, and neurosurgeons are very much aware of this. So for the Neuralink device, they actually have to find areas where there are no blood vessels, and so they only can put the electrodes in where there are no blood vessels, right? So that's a limitation. Whereas the Precision device, since it goes over the surface of the brain, can cover more areas. So you get more surface area covered. So there's also physical issues that come into play that unless you have looked at a brain and played with a brain and operated on a brain, you wouldn't be aware of.
Perhaps you all merge into one, and you have this sort of like surface level coding, and then you also have electrodes inside and electrodes in the blood vessels. I think that's just like an interesting evolution of humanity if this happens. But let's take a step back here. Obviously, now you've I think a really good transition would be this sense of robotics emerging in neurosurgery and in neuroscience. I've always been interested in at what point does neurosurgery and these like highly specialized technical surgical skill sets become replaceable with automation. Obviously, we have sort of the Elon's 3D robot scanner device that inserts these electrodes. But there's a bunch of other techniques that, for example, you've developed that are very difficult to do using robotics. And I want to understand where we're at currently.
Yeah. I've thought about this a little bit, and I even wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe, so it's funny that we're in Boston, that came out maybe a year ago. My sense is that there are some things that AIs and computers and robots are really, really good at. And there are some things that they're not as good at. And there's something that humans are really, really good at. And it has to do with how humans and computers evolved. Like we evolved very, very differently. So human beings evolved on the planet, and a planet that we have to interact with physically in order to survive. Like we are built perfectly to interact with planet Earth, to deal with gravity, and deal with the size of the things that exist on our planet. And we have to make physical decisions. We have physical intuition about the world around us. We just know how much something's going to weigh by looking at it and knowing how much liquid's in it. I know exactly how much it's going to weigh. And if I throw something at you, you'll reach your arm out and grab it in like 2 seconds because you'll know exactly what's happening. And when you do neurosurgery, you're making 1,000 decisions constantly, and you're interacting with the real world. There's a tumor, there's a blood vessel. How much pressure can I put on it to move this blood vessel out of the way? I'm going to play with it a little bit. I'm going to figure that out, and I'm making decision after decision. And every decision I make changes the environment I'm in, which leads to a whole other set of decisions. That's what human beings are really, really good at, physically interacting with the world around us. Computers evolved on a desk with all of their needs provided to them, right? In the Garden of Eden, like they're not searching for food and shelter and things like that. They didn't have to navigate the real world. Everything is provided for them. But they were designed and evolved to solve really complicated problems that require multiple steps that our human brains are not designed for. Like that's what they were designed to do. So an AI will play an enormous role in medicine, and this I could be wrong. So this is a conversation. I'm not telling you I know what I'd love to have your thoughts on this. Mm-hmm. The way AIs are integrating right now into medicine is, if you have to look at a 50 mammograms and figure out which one has the breast cancer, you can feed an AI 1 million mammograms and tell it these 10 have breast cancer, and it will figure out what it is about those 10 that causes breast cancer, and it will become incredibly good at doing that problem. That a human being, our brain will do pretty good at it, but they will be better at that. Same thing with pathology slides. Same thing as if I give you like 1,000, or I give you a number of symptoms, and I say, well, what disease could cause these 50 symptoms? This is like a large language model database that you have to sift through that an AI will be really good at. But if you look at how good robots are at solving physical tasks that are super complicated, my sense is that they're not so great. Like, I remember, you would see a video online of a robot that could go and like make a cup of coffee. And it was like, oh my God, the robot can make a cup of coffee. It basically just had to push a button and then to make a cup of coffee. Like, that's not that complicated. And yes, the autonomous cars have to be able to drive and navigate, but the number of rules and decisions that they have to make while they're driving are sort of limited, is my sense. And again, I'm not a computer programmer, so I could be completely wrong. But I think that doing neurosurgery involves thousands and thousands of small physical task decisions that I think a robot will have a hard time making on its own. And I don't think they're going to replace neurosurgeons so quickly.
I would tend to agree. It seems to me that insofar as medicine is a career where you act on information, you sort of receive informational inputs, you process them, and then you make decisions such as diagnosis or sort of treatment plans. I think that will be intellectually outsourced. It already is. I mean, go to any sort of like doctor's office these days, and they'll usually have some kind of an AI that's assisting them.
Yeah.
But at least the sort of physical manipulation of the real world does seem to be the main bottleneck, right? Like, can you manipulate this object delicately without sort of causing lesions? Can you respond with extremely low latency to changes in the three-dimensional space? That's what AIs like tend to not be very good at. But I think the limitation there is like data, right? Like this, all of the training that you did was someone you standing next to someone, viewing them doing surgery, them like instructing it to you in like natural language, and you being very good at like mirroring their physical maneuverings. And at least right now, it doesn't seem like any robotics models, like foundational models, are very good at doing that. Like they still require a lot of data, even to like pick up an egg and to place it somewhere.
Yeah. There's another element to it, which is there's another decision that we make during surgery, which is when you go into surgery, you do not know how stuck a particular nerve or blood vessel is going to be to the tumor. And you go in with the idea of, I'm going to try to take the whole tumor out. And a tumor applies to anything. It could be, a herniated disc in the spine. It could be an aneurysm you're clipping. But the goal is to accomplish the task with 100% effectiveness. But there are moments where you realize in the middle of a surgery that nerve may get damaged if I take that last bit of tumor off. And that person's face could be paralyzed for the rest of their life, or they might not be able to speak, or they might go blind in an eye if I try to get that whole tumor out. So I have to make a decision at that moment in time. Is it better for me to just leave a little bit of tumor behind so that they can see, or take the tumor out? Because if I don't take it out and it grows, it may need radiation, and the radiation could make them blind. And there's a decision algorithm at that moment in time where you have to say, well, what would I want done if it were me? If it were my eye, would I want to go blind, to have this tumor taken out or not? And how do you put that decision in the mind of an AI or a robot who doesn't know what vision really is and doesn't know what it's like to see their child graduate from college, or to be able to talk to their grandmother, or whatever it is that human function means to that person? A robot and AI will never know that. And whether they will make that decision correctly in the best interest of the patient, or whether they'll just say, oh, I want to get the whole tumor out, I'm going to take the whole tumor out. If the patient goes blind, I don't know. How do I judge that? Mm-hmm. So there's another aspect of the decision making that is a human being making a decision for another human being and determining their future. And again, this goes back to the weight of neurosurgery and the decisions we make, because we have to live with those decisions. And I've often, made the decisions that I thought was the best decision, and occasionally the patient will wake up blind, or the tumor will come back, and they'll say, well, why didn't you take the whole tumor out? And it's because you made the decision that you didn't think you could take it out, or you thought you could take it out without blinding them, but you ended up blinding them, and because you took a little blood vessel in taking out that last tumor. And that, there's an enormous gravity to that you have to live with and explain to another human being. And having dealt with that in the past and that experience, figuring out what to do in the next operation is a decision that is going to be hard for an AI to make.
I hear you on that. I think that it's probably possible that AIs can learn to emulate this kind of human decision-making with enough data and sort of correction from patients sort of post-operation. But to the extent that that particular problem makes it very difficult from a regulatory perspective to remove humans from the loop completely. Yeah. And then I think probably what's even more difficult to solve is the precision of like actuators, right? Like it's like seems really simple, but actually like the biggest bottleneck here is like, can tiny little robotic devices move in very coordinated, extremely precise ways?
So that I think will be the easier thing to solve, because the robot, they'll never have a tremor. You know what I mean? They'll never slip. They'll never, and that's what Elon's thing does is, it very carefully places those electrodes in the brain in a way that's so fine that a human being cannot do it.
But not in a generalizable way. I think the difficulty is, do you have enough data and do you have a good learning algorithm that can capture the gradient descent of how a human learns neurosurgery efficiently? But I think we might be getting too technical there. Definitely an interesting aside. Okay, I think one other thing that I wanted to touch on before we go to your company is just sort of targeted agents, right? So like antibody fluorophores, antibody photosensitizer conjugates for sort of the treatment and the imaging of cancers. Tell us a bit about that and advancements in those fields.
Well, if you can, the human immune system, I guess is how I would start, is an incredibly well-tuned, evolved machine that is built to target any foreign object or any object, like a lock and key in your body, right? So if you can harness the power of the human immune system and control it and teach it the difference between good and bad, right? The tumor is bad, healthy cells are good. Obviously, the human immune system takes out viruses and bacteria and all these bad things. And if it's working well, doesn't take your colon out with it. Obviously we have autoimmune diseases where the immune system attacks the body and you get other diseases. So if we're able to attach some sort of a toxin, or imagine it's like a warhead, you put the nuclear bomb attached to a missile that targets a particular thing. It could be, if it's a fluorophore, it's to image it, but if it could be radioactive to kill it, or a toxin, it allows us to target things on the level of the individual cell, right? Because now we're able to essentially operate on a level of an individual cell, which we can't do as human beings because, our scalpels are so big. No matter how small we make them, and our vision is limited, we can't operate on the level of the individual cell. And the level of the individual cell is the fineness that we need to manipulate the body, in its most effective way. And targeted or immuno-guided therapies essentially are surgeons and medicines that work at the level of the individual cell. When you take a drug, most of the treatments we do medically, we're either taking a pill or we're doing surgery. And if you're doing surgery, you're working on the level of millimeters, right? If you're taking a drug, that drug goes throughout your entire body. That's why we have side effects from every drug. But if you can target that drug, harnessing the power of the immune system to only go to the bad cells and to not touch any of the good cells, it's incredibly powerful. And so that's what immunotherapy does. And that's what vaccines do, cancer vaccines. It's all about trying to target cells based on the receptors, because every cell is different. And if you have something that only targets the bad cells and leaves the good cells alone, you can harness that like a lock and key to be, or a targeted missile to destroy anything that you want and preserve all the healthy, good tissue.
Absolutely. And to my knowledge, these are being used, at least explored clinically for sort of head and neck cancers. Are they also being explored in neurosurgery?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's been some great therapy with CAR T cell therapy, some really novel, interesting results with glioblastoma, which is sort of our most devastating, worst disease, which is the malignant brain tumor that infiltrates into the brain, is almost uniformly fatal, although there are some long-term survivors for sure, but it's a really tough tumor to beat that we have been, hacking at with hacksaws and basically just barely chipped the surface of glioblastoma. But the New England Journal of Medicine and some other publications have published some really interesting results of CAR T therapy where you're taking T cells and trying to direct them against these malignant bad cells, so they attack them, your immune system.
Got it. Just for our audience, this was historically challenging because penetration to solid tumors is very difficult. I don't think this is your area of expertise, but just what's your prognosis on solid tumor infiltration of CAR T? Do we need a different modality? What's the space at the moment?
Yeah, I'm not a researcher in that space, so I can't give you the cutting edge state of the art, but I can tell you that I spoke before about focused ultrasound, for example. So if you're interested in delivering, and how do you deliver to a solid tumor, if you can use focused ultrasound to break down the blood-brain barrier, or if there's a blood tumor barrier, or if there's necrotic parts of the cell that things can't get into, we can now manipulate externally using energy that passes into the tumor to try to allow drugs to penetrate or treatments to penetrate more selectively.
Got it. Interesting. So we've definitely come full circle here, explored all of the major developing technologies in sort of neurosurgery and neuroscience more broadly, BCIs. Let's come to your full circle on your career as well. So obviously you've transitioned now into entrepreneurship, and we talked briefly about this before the podcast, but what's the update on your end? Why have you stepped back from clinical medicine for now?
So, as I mentioned before, I woke up in the middle of the night with an idea. And it's one of those things that you think about and then it starts to eat away at you. You know, we talked about curiosity and how curiosity drives you. And I spent my life treating one patient at a time. And I realized that if I were to create a device that I thought could change the way we practice medicine, I could help thousands or hundreds of thousands of patients, and not just one at a time. And that was very appealing to me. And it also was a problem, like it was a physics problem. It was a problem we had to solve. And it was also a different muscle that I hadn't exercised, which is this idea of creating a company around a new idea and building a team to solve a problem. And so I decided to devote my time to try to get this company going with the idea that I'd go back into clinical medicine. Like I love being a neurosurgeon. It is an incredibly gratifying career. And I don't want to step away from it for too long. And so my plan is to go back relatively soon, but I felt in order to get this going, I had to really give 100% of my effort to it. And it's been incredibly productive. And so I was in some surgeries, and just to give you an example. So I talked to you before about transorbital surgery. So when we make an incision in the eyelid to do surgery, we're retracting the orbit out of the way. Every 20 minutes, we have to stop the operation because we have to check the pupil. Because if you retract on the orbit too much, the way you see that the eye is not working well is the pupil stops responding to light. So every 20 minutes, we're doing this complex brain surgery. We have to stop the surgery, take all our instruments out, open up the eyelid, because that's the only way to check the pupil, and see if the pupil is still responding. And it's really frustrating to stop a 4-hour surgery every 20 minutes, particularly when like you're about to remove the most critical part of the tumor, and the eye surgeon you're working with says, oh, we got to stop, we got to make sure the pupils, and you're like, oh, really? Like it took me 3 hours to dissect here, and now you're stopping the operation. So I woke up at 2 a.m. and I was like, why don't we have a way to monitor the pupil continuously? Like, why do we have to do this intermittently? And then I subsequently had another patient where we were placing electrodes in the brain for epilepsy, which is another specialty I had. And we put the electrodes in, and there were no responses from the electrodes, like zero, flat line. And we were trying to figure out what went wrong, what happened, and we couldn't figure it out. And there had been a little bit of bleeding when we put an electrode in. And we suddenly said, let's check the pupil. So we literally took down all the drapes. We had to undrape the patient, undrape their head, and one of their pupils was dilated, which is a really bad sign. And it was a sign that there was bleeding pushing on the brain on that side. So we had to do an emergency surgery, open up the side of the head, take out the blood, try to save this woman's life. And if we'd been able to monitor the pupil continuously during that operation, we would have known this an hour ago, and we never would have had a problem. But there's no way to monitor the pupil continuously in the operating room or in the ICU. And so I started to think about that. And I had one idea as to how to do it. And once I started really working on it full time, I totally changed the way to do it, because I started to read more and educate myself more, and read also all the patents that were out there, because there's a lot of patents about monitoring the eye. And so we had to figure out how to get around those patents and which ones existed. And so I called up a longtime collaborator of mine who's an electrical optical engineer who I've collaborated with in my lab for 20 years, and started to talk to him about it. He goes, yeah, like I can solve that problem for you. Like, we can do this together. This is how we're going to do it. I was like, great, let's make this happen. And so we started a company, we patented the idea, we hired an engineer, another engineer, we got all these consultants, and it's been really fun and exciting to try to build something that doesn't exist.
I think that's a definition of lived experience, and sort of why a lot of these startup accelerator programs and VCs really care about, like, why is this a problem? Like, how did you come across the problem? It's like you actually had to become a neurosurgeon and experience the problem, and that gives you alpha, it gives you edge in being able to start a company and to outcompete other people that are more naive going into it, and potentially to be kind of like an N of one, right? You don't want to have competitors. You want to have a monopoly on the market. So yeah, very interesting idea. Talk to us about what this transition has now been like. Like obviously it's been, are you a first time founder or had you previously started a company?
No, first time.
That's very fascinating. What's that been like? Do you feel like you've made mistakes? Do you feel like you've learned a lot already?
Well, the hardest thing about it for me was not being a neurosurgeon, because that was part of my identity, right? So I didn't realize how difficult it was going to be to not wake up and take care of patients every day and do the thing that I did for 40 years and just stop doing it for a period of time. So that's been challenging. But in terms of the entrepreneurial part of it, I mean, it's been just fun, like learning all the different things that you have to learn. Like I spent the whole day reading FDA guidelines on devices and what are the requirements for safety, and, you know, sort of trying to really understand that and talking. I've talked to, you know, maybe 20 CEOs of MedTech startups to say, hey, what mistakes did you make? What advice do you have for me? You know, corporate lawyers, like, should we be an LLC? Should we be a C Corp? How much are we supposed to give away? Reading VC books, you know, to try to figure out how eventually I'm going to raise the money I need to, learn about safes and learn about dilution and all of that stuff. It's all available. Like it's all out there, which is great because you can just get on your computer and just spend the day reading and learning and figuring it out. And the other thing is that there's also great podcasts. Speaking of podcasts, like there's these MedTech podcasts that I started listening to, and you listen to other people. And most people say, like, if you've developed one MedTech device, you've developed one, you learn the pathway for one MedTech device. In other words, every device is so unique and so different that there's not a common way to do it. There's not one way to do it. Because, you know, there's class 1, class 2, class 3 with the FDA. And do you need a 510K? And is there a predicate device? And are you doing a de novo application? Or all of that stuff is unique to your device. And that's why everyone gets these pre-submission meetings with the FDA, because they don't really know what the FDA is going to want them to do. And the FDA, you know, doesn't really know because they've never seen a device like yours. So everyone's kind of trying to figure it out in a conversation, is the way it seems to me. My advantage is, of course, I've been in clinical medicine for 25 years, and I know, you know, I know how this thing could be used. I know how it could be integrated. I know who the doctors are that are the key opinion leaders and thought leaders that I can call on the phone and say, what do you think of this and how should we design it? I know how I'd want to use it. I know how nurses take care of patients in the ICU. Like I already know, I lived that. I know how surgeons and anesthesiologists monitor patients in the OR. I don't need to ask someone how to do that. I know exactly how to do that, and I can bring that in as we're designing the device and as we're making decisions very early on, which is fun, you know. I'm also writing a lot of grants, which I enjoy doing. We talked about grant writing to get non-dilutive funding, which a lot of VCs are like, why are you wasting your time? Like, you know, you should just raise, you know, VC money. Things will move faster than waiting for grant money. But I find the writing of the grant and putting your ideas down on paper really makes you have to decide exactly what you're going to do and why you're going to do it and rationalize it and figure out what experiments, you know, what proof of principle you need to do in your modeling to prove that this is going to happen. So just the act of writing a grant, I think, is very valuable, even though it does take an enormous amount of time. But now I have all the time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just, is this the context in which you met Tyler Cohen, by the way? Or like, so he issues grants and whatnot?
No, Tyler read my book on a lark and really loved it and just called me out of the blue and said, can I interview for my podcast? The funny story is I didn't know who he was, Tyler Cowen. He's a famous economist, but I'm not in economics, so I didn't know who he was. So I got an email that said, do you want to do this podcast, Conversations with Tyler? And it was at a stage where I was promoting my book, and I didn't know if Tyler was like some teenager who was going to interview me from his parents' basement, right? I didn't know who Tyler was because it didn't say his last name even. It's just Conversations with Tyler. And I was saying yes to everybody. I was like, sure, I'll do it. And then as I started to look it up, I was like, oh, wow, this is a big deal. Like, I'm really excited to talk to him. Yes. And we had a great conversation, which was really nice.
Yeah, he's definitely the grandfather of many in the entrepreneurship world at the moment. But, you know, you're coming into this at a really challenging time in the fundraising ecosystem as well, which is really interesting because you sort of expect that someone with your pedigree and portfolio would have a really easy time to raise funding? Obviously, you haven't tried yet, but what is stopping you? Like, what do you feel needs to be validated before you go speak to VCs?
Yeah, I think that my understanding of the world of startups is that I want to create value. If I just have an idea, and I haven't actually built the device and shown that it works, it's just an idea, and that's worth a certain amount. Like your idea is worth a certain amount. A working prototype is worth a little bit more, right? A working prototype that you've tested on humans and shown that it really works is worth even more. And the farther I can get it before I speak to the VCs, the more the valuation of the company is going to be at that moment in time. And my understanding is that I do want to wait a little bit to make sure that I can create more value, and the patent, I want to make sure that the patent is, farther along as opposed to just a provisional patent that we may or may not get, again, that's value. I could be wrong with that, but that's my sense. I mean, I will talk to anyone. I have spoken to some VCs, and most of them have said, well, come to me when you have a working prototype, come to me when you have some more data. I think they're a little reluctant too to get involved so early because it's risk, right? They want to mitigate their risk. And the more value I can create and the more risk reduction I can create for them, the happier we both will be in the relationship.
I think that's definitely one way to do it. And there's no right way, right? Like I've seen people that raise purely on an idea or an hype and they're successful, and people that raise on a great scientific pedigree and scientific rigor in their early data, and they just have a plan for a clinical trial and they just say fund the clinical trial, and the investors also bite and it goes well. There's no right way to do it, but I think taking the slower, measured approach is probably the more responsible thing to do with investor dollars, and I don't have any thoughts on that. But yeah, like I think it's really great what you're doing, and it speaks of the fact that medicine is not a career that necessarily is stagnant. Like in a lot of people's minds, they think of surgery particularly being this repetitive exercise that just demands physical rigor. Like you wake up early in the morning, you keep doing the exact same thing. But it does seem, at least from what you're saying, that it's like a more intellectually stimulating, versatile, and kind of what's the right word here? So sort of just like you can take a step back, you can build things, you can be the founder in your own way, whether it's the founder of a new field or the founder of a new technique, or the founder of a company, whether it's biotech or medtech, and then come back, right? If it's sort of your passion. Do you think that's a fair framing?
When I first was deciding to become a surgeon, I was worried that it would be very repetitive, because I think I watched some general surgeons doing hernia operations, and it's essentially the same operation over and over again. But neurosurgery is not like that, and particularly tumors, aneurysms, because every single tumor is different than another one that you did. There's no two that are identical. They're all in a slightly different place. They're a slightly different consistency. It's obviously in a different human being. They're more or less stuck to whatever is around them. And so you literally have to think every single time that you go into the operating room to do a surgery. There's some surgeries that are more routine. You're like, I'm putting an electrode in the thalamus. Like, okay, there's one electrode you're putting in the thalamus. So it's the same operation more or less every single time. Or I'm draining a subdural hematoma, something like that. You're putting 2 holes in the head to drain blood. Like that gets a little routine. But what I was lucky enough to be able to do, which is sort of complex skull-based tumor surgery, was a real puzzle every time that you had to think about to get going. So that was not repetitive. In terms of moving back and forth, I think as a surgeon, experience is incredibly important. So I think if you leave surgery 5 years in, you've shortchanged yourself and your patients, and you want to come back. Because for me, it took me like 20 years to learn how to do neurosurgery well, and I'm still getting better at it. Like it's one of those things it's like golf. Like you can just keep playing it forever and still feel like you are trying to get better because it's so difficult to do. And so I think this was the right time, but I don't want to be away from it for too long. Like, I have to get back to it. It's calling to me, and I mean, physically, like I'm actually in great shape because I have more time to exercise than I did in the past. And exercise was always a big part of my life, like strengthening my core so that I didn't have that back pain that I had when I started being a neurosurgeon. It's gone away completely because of knowing what exercises to do to strengthen your core so you can stand for 5 or 6 hours at a time without having pain. It's time.
Absolutely. My hypothesis or theory is that your H index is very much tied to your physical fitness. I've seen this in just like so many Harvard professors, MIT professors, high H index, like clinician scientists. They're all just like super physically fit. Like they prioritize health as the very first thing in their life. That's just an aside there. But Ted, one of the things I wanted to get to actually was a bit of a rapid fire round. So we're going to switch things up a little bit. I want you to just come up with the first thing that comes to your mind, basically.
Wait, my father was a psychoanalyst. I don't like this.
So I know you play bass guitar. What's your favorite song to jam to?
I've been playing The Chicken a lot lately.
The Chicken?
The Chicken, yes.
Okay. We'll
It's a funky tune, and Jaco Pastorius did a great cover of it, if you've never heard it.
Awesome. We'll get the editor to play it in the background here. So you obviously studied philosophy and English during your undergraduate degree. What stayed with you more over the years?
The philosophy or the English? Probably the philosophy. I read more philosophical-minded books and podcasts at the moment.
What's sort of your favorite podcasts on philosophy?
Usually about free will and consciousness. I'm reading a book about free will right now that someone sent to me. I just think that is a fascinating topic that we just haven't cracked yet, and it's really a mystery.
Got it. What's one neurosurgical innovation that you wish existed right now? Besides your company. I guess it's not really neurosurgical, but.
Yeah, no, that's a good, I mean, you're sort of asking me to think of something that doesn't exist. It's like predicting the future. It's really hard to do because it doesn't exist and the future's unpredictable. I talked about the ability, so here's something I wish we had. So I do a surgery where we take out, it's called Cushing's disease, right? It's named after Harvey Cushing. And it's a tumor in your pituitary gland that essentially increases the level of cortisol in your blood. It does it indirectly, but your cortisol goes up. Many of the times when we operate on those tumors, the tumors are so small you cannot see them. So you, as a surgeon, on the MRI scan, the pituitary gland looks normal. You do a surgery, you open up and look at the pituitary gland, it looks normal. So what do you take out? How do you find it? That's the hardest part of doing that surgery. And I wish we had a fluorescent dye, just like you labeled, that's what you mentioned, that would label the tumor so that if I open up and I start cutting into the tumor, suddenly, boom, there's a fluorescent light that shows me exactly where the tumor is and I can take it out. Because it's crazy that in this day and age, we have surgeons operating on normal MRI scans and taking out parts of a normal organ that they cannot see the tumor in to try to cure people of the tumor. And the way we do it is we literally just start slicing into it and trying to find it, and we hack out parts of the pituitary gland because it's a devastating disease if you can't cure it surgically. But it's an awful surgery to do because you don't know until 24 hours later when you check the cortisol if it's worked or not.
Interesting. If there's a PhD student listening to this episode, there's some low-hanging fruit for you on a biotech company there. What's one place that anchors you to your childhood, that inner curiosity that you had that sort of got you this far? Is there a place that you retreat to kind of unwind, relax, escape?
For me, it's listening to music, probably. So I would say listening to classical music and reading. So I grew up in a household where my father listened to classical music constantly. And I was a jazz musician. And so I would make fun of the fact, I hate classical music. But now, when I listen to classical music, it puts me in a state of mind that is this comfort state of peace, because I grew up in a household where I felt loved and taken care of, and it was a place where I wanted to be, and my father would actually listen to classical music and read. That's what he would do on Saturdays and Sundays. That's how he spent his day. And so every once in a while, I'll put myself in that zone, and it's just a beautiful, relaxing thing for me to do.
That is beautiful. I'm very much convinced now that your like main advantage is being able to enjoy doing things that everyone doesn't enjoy doing, right? You've got neurosurgery, you've got reading, you've got listening to classical music, grant writing. I mean, wow, that's an incredible combination. Last question for you. Besides your book, what is one book that you'd recommend to our audience and why? Especially maybe one recently that you've read on startups, right?
Well, this book I read, and I'm forgetting the title. It's something about Sand Hill Road, or what's that book?
I think just that enough is enough for our audience to find it. The
idea behind that book, Secrets of Sand Hill Road, was to say, trying to tell founders how VCs think. That's what I got away from it, and what's important to them when you're raising money from them. And as I mentioned, it's learning new things. I heard someone mention it on a podcast, a startup podcast, and I was like, I'll buy that book and read it. And I read it, and man, it was super interesting and opened my eyes to a world that I had no idea about.
Fantastic. Well, Ted, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for coming on.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.